Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Howard Husock, Vice President for Policy Research at the Manhattan Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to an event tonight sponsored by our Adam Smith Society entitled Considering Social Responsibility. As you know, the Adam Smith Society is based at business schools around the country and based around ideas that business school students have an interest in the structure and the principles of free market economics, but also a stake in public policy debates about how such economics should be regulated. There are aspects of those debates which reach into the curriculum of business schools themselves. In that context, in recent years, the questions of responsibilities of firms to do more than simply find a route to profitability has been especially notable. No doubt all of you are familiar with the concepts of corporate social responsibility, social enterprise, the triple bottom line, all of which involved what's called a stakeholder model of capitalism, in which corporate activity should benefit not just owners and employees, but communities, the environment, and others with an interest in social justice, I suppose they might say. Indeed, all of the 15 business schools that are part of the Adam Smith Society network have active coursework in this area and clubs, as well as faculties who specialize in it. In fact, according to a survey conducted by the Aspen Institute's Beyond Gray Pinstripes initiative, I think I'm wearing gray pinstripes. Wow, I should have noticed that. Yeah. Since what they called the devastating global financial crisis of 2008, there's been evidence of significant change in MBA curricular offerings and faculty research, including more courses with content on social, ethical, and environmental issues, more that zero in on the role for business as an agent for social change, and expose students to content and research by faculty on these topics. Indeed, 79% of business schools surveyed require coursework in these areas. Well, despite its pervasiveness, the concept of corporate social responsibility does have its critics. In 1970, Milton Friedman famously stated that there's one and only social responsibility of business: to use its resources to engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. That is, it engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. In Capitalism and Freedom, he called corporate social responsibility a fundamentally subversive doctrine in a free society. Yet, there can be little doubt that a public and perhaps an employee expectation has arisen that business has responsibilities that transcend that traditional bottom line. With such tensions in mind, what's the appropriate role for business education? Should it validate CSR by including it in its curriculum? Should it be included in coursework, if only because there are employment opportunities in its application? Indeed, what should we be thinking about corporate social responsibility more broadly? Well, tonight we're lucky to be joined by two guests who take different views on these matters, who together will help us gain more insight into the concept, its critiques, and its application on campus and in the business community more broadly. First, to my immediate right is Andrew Savitz, who quite literally wrote the book, The Triple Bottom Line, the second edition of which just came out this past October. He's the author as well of Talent Transformation and the Triple Bottom Line: How Companies Can Leverage Human Resources to Achieve Sustainable Growth. And he was a lead partner in PricewaterhouseCoopers' Global Sustainability Business Services practice, and was also PwC's liaison delegate to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He previously served as general counsel in the Massachusetts Office of Environmental Affairs. Holds a JD from Georgetown, earned a postgraduate degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, while a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Luke Johnson, to my far right, is the chairman of private equity house Risk Capital Partners, LLP, and the former chairman of Channel 4 Television. That's in the UK, obviously. He writes a weekly column on entrepreneurship for the Financial Times. Some of us like it a lot. Michael Bloomberg, by the way, calls the FT his favorite newspaper. Mr. Johnson also wrote a weekly column on business matters for the Sunday Telegraph between 1999 and 2006. Among his many philanthropic interests, he's the chairman of Startup Britain, the national campaign in support of entrepreneurship in that country. In October 2013, he co-founded and launched the Center for Entrepreneurs, a nonprofit think tank aiming to address what he called the underrepresentation of entrepreneurs in the public eye. He is the author as well of several books. Most recent work is Start It Up, Why Running Your Own Business is Easier Than You Think. We will have opening remarks from Andy, if I might. Rebuttal, I suppose we'd have to call it, from Luke. And then I'll moderate for a while and then open it up. So, Andrew Savitz.
Well, thank you. I'm not even sure why we're here. I started getting quite worked up. Well, I started getting quite worked up on the train. I came down from Boston. And, the idea that we're still debating whether corporate social responsibility sort of should be taught on campuses or should be practiced by business is a bit, I thought we were beyond this. This is a very profound change that has taken place over the last 15 years in how businesses view the world and how the world views business. For those of you who are sort of steeped in this, sustainability came out of the United Nations, and it completely changed the idea of how we create wealth and what wealth is. It's basically the idea that we have to do business in a way that meets our needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And that's a very profound way and a paradigm change in how people think about wealth creation. It's not just about creating wealth in the present moment. It's, does the process of creating wealth compromise the ability of future generations, of our children, to live a decent life? And we can think of many examples where capitalism has created very large holes that our children are going to spend quite a bit of their GNP digging out of. So I work with companies who are trying to grapple with this, and I can tell you that this is changing thinking, activities, and behavior. I mean, thinking, for example. Obesity is rocking the food industry. Climate change is transforming the automobile industry. I mean, think about the Prius and electric cars and Tesla. The pandemics has changed the entire pharmaceutical business model. You can't sell drugs at market prices. If you've got life-saving drugs in countries like India, you have to give them away in order to be allowed into the marketplace. Activities. I could really talk for quite a while about this, but there are now 6,000 corporations that are producing annual sustainability reports. And many of them have sort of dropped the sort of bogus idea that there is financial information and non-financial information, and they have begun to integrate their financial reports with their quote-unquote triple bottom line or sustainability reports. And that is because we are in a world of uncertainty, and the kind of risks that business face is very different than, climate change was not, I remember talking to, when I was a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, I remember talking to one of the lead auditor for one of the big three automobile companies and saying, Jeff, the day is coming when, this whole extreme weather thing is really going to be changing, what your client's doing. And he laughed at me. He never even heard of climate change. And now, his client, that's all they, one of the main things they discuss. So the businesses are facing material risks and opportunities that they never faced before. Plus, the expectations of stakeholders, from customers to suppliers to communities, is changing. The expectations on businesses has grown enormously. I have a client that manufactures 38 billion beer cans a year. Beer cans. And I was there this week, and the CEO of the company was saying 40% of our investors are screening us for our triple bottom line impacts, for our social and environmental impacts. This is a beer can company. So, and the third way things are changing for companies are in people's beliefs. People, and I've written a book about the relationship between sustainability and the war for talent. and employees. You know, people want to work for organizations that not only make a profit, but that are doing something for a higher and better purpose. You know, the data is clear about this, and this is especially true of younger people coming out of today's business schools and undergraduate campuses. You know, they've grown up with this. I have very young children, and in their elementary school, every day is Earth Day. You know, when I went to law school, there was no environmental law program being offered. People believe, I think, that unless we find ways to either harness or unleash the power of the private sector on the problems that we face as a globe, we're toast. There is no other way. Government is not going to solve these problems. NGOs are not going to solve these problems. It's really up to business to begin to address and deal with these issues, and it's happening. Many of you may know about B corporations. These are benefit corporations. That there's new corporate forms. People are starting companies that are designed both for social good and for financial gain. So they begin ab initio, from the beginning, to try and meld these two great purposes of, you know, social enterprise and business enterprise. And eventually these distinctions will disappear. So give it your best shot, Luke. I'm very interested to hear why this is a bad idea.
Well, I guess there's two ways one can play this. I can sort of broadly agree with much of what you say, which would make for a much more relaxed and comfortable evening. But that would be a bit boring, wouldn't it? So we'll see how we can go. I think it's always interesting. I arrived this afternoon into America, and it's a great reminder that this is an unbelievably wealthy country, easily the richest country in the world. And I think you as Americans, I'm assuming you're mostly American, perhaps don't see just how rich you are. And because America is so rich and so successful, it can afford lots of stuff like CSR. Because unless you're a big corporation, politically correct concepts can get very, very expensive. Now, ideal generally, my CV here is not real because my day job is running and starting businesses. That's what I've done since I was 18. And I don't know how many people here have ever started a business. I hope to God all of you who are studying an MBA are not going to go into a career in CSR, but you're going to start a business. Because Gallup do a survey every year all across the world, and they ask tens of thousands of people from many different countries what is the most important thing they want. Do you know what it is? They want a good job. Now, where do they come from? Apart from a few sort of consultants in CSR, that doesn't really create many jobs. What creates jobs are entrepreneurs, individuals who come up with new ideas, innovations. That's how wealth is created. Now, any rational entrepreneur wants their business to endure. They want it to be sustainable. They realize that they don't only have shareholders to worry about. Often it's just themselves. They have staff, they have customers. They want repeat business. Any company that is a hit and run business that is there for the shorter term is not going to make that owner wealthy, and they're not going to make their community wealthy. So by its very nature, business is, in a sense, entrepreneurship is deferred gratification. The very first entrepreneurs in ancient Middle East were those who discovered agriculture. Agriculture at its very heart is sustainability. It's about crops and it's about deferred gratification. So the idea that business is sort of reflexly short-term and damaging to society is wrong. One of the things I find very disappointing about those who bang on to the private sector that if they don't engage massively, then we're all doomed, is it's an unbelievably pessimistic and I think inaccurate view of the world. And I think it's partly tempered by the fact that I chaired Britain's fourth free-to-air television broadcast at Channel 4. And spending 6 years doing that, I realized that, ultimately, most journalists, the media, believe bad news sells. But that doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of where we are in existence. There are fewer wars, less disease, and less poverty than ever before in history. And the idea that is amazingly frequently propagated on the left of centre, that we are on the edge of a precipice, that society is existentially threatened, is poppycock. It simply isn't true. The fact is that if you look through history, and my father's an historian and he taught me this, the optimists always win. We've all forgotten all the pessimists. Who are they? It's the believers and the inventors, those who were making the advances in society and believing in a positive future rather than the idea that things were getting worse and we are under this terrible threat of, pollution, environmental disaster, whatever else CSR might sell its services on. In the long run, they've been proven wrong. As I say, my experience and my work day in, day out is building small companies from scratch, and that's where Apple and Tesla and all the others came from. And it's real hard in the beginning because very often you're desperately struggling to raise capital and you are fighting against much bigger behemoth corporations who are very often have oligopolies and such vast market shares that they can afford whole departments doing nice fluffy things like CSR. But actually the bulk of all job creation is smaller, newer businesses. They also punch wildly above their weight in terms of innovation. And they are, frankly, too busy trying to make ends meet very often to worry about saving the world. And if we just pick up on, for example, one or two of the specific case studies that Andrew talked about earlier. Now, Tesla. Now, anyone who has really looked at this knows that in net terms it uses much more energy for the world to go about manufacturing those electric batteries those expensive cars use, and using that as a source of energy and power, than fossil fuels. Its net produces more carbon. It also relies on massive subsidy from the taxpayer. And of course, the only people who can afford to buy Teslas are the wealthy. So effectively, Tesla car is a subsidy from the poor to the rich. Now, I don't know quite why that is CSR. It's slightly beyond me. I can see it's nice for Elon Musk, but for the rest of us, I'm not so sure. And in terms of the drug industry, my wife, who's over there, has been a pharmacist all her career. I chair a thing called the Institute of Cancer Research, which is in the top 5 cancer laboratories. It's, funnily enough, a social enterprise, a non-profit. We have 1,000 scientists in London. We have a bigger pipeline of cancer drugs than any other non-profit in the world. We're in the top 5 cancer research organizations in the world. And through that, I've spent quite a lot of time recently studying the pharma industry. And I happen to think the pharma industry is one of the most demonized there is. Fundamentally, pharma is about saving lives. And yet the way it's covered in a lot of the media, you would think that they were all engaged in creating Frankenstein monsters or something. I saw earlier this week, for example, a Japanese drug company here was fined $5 billion by a court in the case of one individual. It's a bit like the case of British Petroleum, as your president called it, having to pay $40 billion for the Gulf of Mexico accident. Now, it's only because America is so unbelievably rich. It's only because there are still a few handful of corporations as big as BP that can pay $40 billion that that took place. And the truth of the matter is that I think one of the driving forces behind a lot of CSR are things like litigation, things like ambulance chasing law firms who see business as soft targets, easy living. And I think one of the reasons why, if any of you are to become entrepreneurs here in the future in America, or indeed all of you should care about your standard of living and wealth creation in your nation and challenging one of the great evils of our time, which is unemployment, you should worry about your competitiveness. Because believe me, don't think they're having debates much like this out in China or in Indonesia or in Hong Kong or many other rapidly emerging super competitive countries around the world. These places are intent on taking your market share, shifting jobs over there, and building their economies rapidly. So I accept that America is wealthy enough these days to be able to afford things like CSR. And I'm not saying all of CSR by any means is all wrong or bad, but the fact is it's something of an extravagance, I believe, and that the priority of business should fundamentally be business, and that the most important byproduct of that is, yes, wealth creation, but very much next, it's jobs. And that's what business does. It creates jobs, and that's what we all need. Thank you.
Well, it's tempting to just ask Andy, well, what about that? But
well, let me,
but hang in there. I'm going to try to focus things a little bit.
I don't know where to begin.
Yeah, but let me try to focus things and give you a place to begin.
Okay.
Right. So Luke is focused very much, and in keeping with his work on entrepreneurship, by saying that, well, corporate social responsibility becomes a kind of a burden, if you will, or a mandate, or luxury, I think he would have said, on corporations that can afford it. So it creates a form of what some call corporatism. Big players can afford it, and by extension, make it hard for newcomers to make progress. That they couldn't afford those kind of mandates, and therefore they might get squeezed out altogether, whether from investment or simple lack of talent. How do you think about this entrepreneurship versus corporate social responsibility argument?
Well, the good news is I think a lot of entrepreneurs have actually set themselves to trying to solve social problems. The idea of social enterprise is not saying that you do things simply for the common good, but many of the startups around the world are trying to solve these big problems. I mean, look at the amount of entrepreneurship that has been directed toward climate change. I'm not saying, I happen to think, we are sitting in the place where Superstorm Sandy put half the city underwater. I mean, I think it's quite clear that the weather is getting more extreme. But even if you don't believe it, it's probably prudent to take steps to deal with it. And many startup companies are trying to address this. They're incredible on entrepreneurship around energy conservation. I mean, I can't begin to tell you how many companies in Boston have been created. So I think we have some common ground here. I mean, if this wasn't a real, the world is facing problems. I don't think there's any question about that. Even wealth creation is a problem, or it's a two-edged sword. If you could flick a switch and everyone in the world began to consume goods at the same rate as the people in this room, it would take 7 planet Earths or something like this, so call it 4. But it would take a lot more resources than exist in the world. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but many scientists believe that we are using resources at a higher level than can be replenished by natural processes. So these are problems, not every single, yes, I'm a consultant, I make money on fear, dread, and uncertainty. So yes, these problems are good for CSR consultants, but that doesn't make them any less real. The natural resource intensity that a growing Chinese economy, needs is, they need resources that don't exist. Luke talked about food. Well, I worked for PepsiCo on this for 7 years. climate change is going to completely, and is already disrupting, food supply. I mean, we grow a very high percentage of food, within 10 degrees of the equator or 15 degrees of the equator. That's changing completely. The more fertile areas, if scientists are correct about what's happening to the climate, are going to be moving. This creates enormous risk for society. There are opportunities too. So I'm not necessarily somebody who says corporations cause problems. Although we are sitting here today with a General Motors that, knew about a fatal defect in its product apparently for 10 years and hid the fact from the world. I mean, so, corporations aren't, but I'm not saying they're the cause of the problems in many cases. I'm saying that they need to address them, and so do entrepreneurs. And the good news is there's, for those of you who are, very free market, and wealth is the whole game, there's plenty of wealth opportunities in this business. I think that many of the most successful, and that's what big corporations are trying to do. This is not about philanthropy, okay? CSR has nothing to do with philanthropy. This is not about giving money away. This is about making more money by figuring out ways to meet the needs of society and the environment as a way to make profit.
I see Luke scribbling away, and I'm tempted to say, "What's in your notebook?" But
shopping list for next week.
Yeah.
He is so engaged.
Yeah, but let me turn Andy's point to you, which is he was talking about B corporations, social enterprises, new entrepreneurs who are in a self-aware way trying to take on environmental problems, particularly, I think, right, or help indigenous people by marketing their products, so to combat poverty. Isn't this maybe a new stage of capitalism and entrepreneurship that we ought to applaud?
Sure. I'm in favor of more entrepreneurs of every sort. Social entrepreneurs, for-profit, I'm in favor of it all. And whether it be in, new sorts of foodstuffs or clean tech or whatever, I think that's great. But I think it's about priorities, isn't it? And I think Andy was sort of, using the word problem all the time. I would always see opportunity. He's clearly much better than me at predicting the future, talking about how climate in years to come is all going to change. I have no idea. I'm not a climate scientist. I have trouble predicting in all the businesses I'm involved with what the numbers are going to be next week. So I do think predicting the future is tough. And I think a lot of climate scientists have found it very difficult to predict what our climate has been like over recent years. So there are certainly some grounds for questioning some of those projections. And moreover, I think some of the solutions, such as massive investment in very inefficient new forms of energy creation like wind farms, or converting corn into fuel, all these things massively reliant on subsidy, are not necessarily very well advised. I am involved in the world of cancer through this research centre. I would argue that, addressing the issues of today's problems, cancer, for example, is pretty damn important. And I would hate to think that society diverts a lot of its resources towards wind farms rather than finding new cures for cancer. I worry that what can happen in business in countries like America, or indeed around the world, where it's very successful, very profitable, is that it's seen as easy meat, so that both litigants, General Motors, for example, or those who would embarrass business into funding new apologetic departments, if you like, for free enterprise, would take advantage of all that profitability and say, well, you can afford to have some of these indulgences. Let's do a big chunk of the annual report on CSR and all go through the motions on the board and everyone would feel better, does it really make any difference? Does it matter? Is it really addressing any problems? Is it solving them even? And is it not just a distraction from the business of business? I wonder. Certainly, I find that it's very much more, you get a lot of boards of large corporations that are full of academics. And academics deal a great deal in theory. I'm afraid to say that, you find this even on MBA courses, rather than the gritty reality of having to roll your sleeves up and win customers, make a margin, generate cash, maybe use your own credit card to meet this month's payroll, which is what entrepreneurs are concerned about, not having the house taken, etc. And like I say, it can come across, I think, to people who are in the front line of business as a bit self-indulgent.
Well, may I?
Okay.
You can say that you can't predict the future, and I think that's right, and I'm not trying to. But I think we can all agree that the per capita income of China has gone up. I don't think that's a matter of predicting the future, but the per capita income of China has gone to $5,000 per person.
Well, is that wonderful?
That's
They're
fabulous.
getting rich. I love it.
That's right. However, part of that is they want to eat hamburgers now.
And why shouldn't they?
Because it takes 10 times the natural resources to produce 1 calorie from meat as it does to produce a calorie from grain. And you can say, well, fine. They're entitled to it, and they probably are. But it is creating stress on the natural environment. And if we simply go willy-nilly and just say, wealth creation is good, and the unintended or side effects of wealth creation, well, that's predicting the future, and I can't predict the future. That is irresponsible, in my opinion.
Well, Andy, that's always been handled through regulation. Regulation as weighed by democratic governance. And so is CSR then, do you have any risk that pressure groups with their own agenda, their own idea about what the major environmental threats are, would push PepsiCo or Monsanto or anybody else? Let's say Greenpeace decides genetically modified foods are really bad, and they're going to really give Monsanto a hard time, and the Chinese who want that more food aren't going to get it as easily because there won't be the genetic modifications. Well, that's just, historically, the Food and Drug Administration or the Federal Trade Commission would weigh that. I guess I'm asking, who elected the CSR guys?
It's a free market of ideas and a free market of consumers and a free market of investors and a free market of employees. Nobody elected them, but people do not have to work and do not like to work for companies that are considered part of the problem. Communities do not want, irresponsible businesses in their neighborhoods. Ask Luke how he would feel about government imposing more regulation. I think we can agree that government is not the answer to these problems. That used to be the idea, but for various reasons, and this will get us off on a tangent, the government is not the answer. The private sector, I think, must begin to address these problems as a matter of their own survival and as a matter of our survival. Business can't succeed in a society that fails.
What about that, Luke? It's a really fascinating idea that the scope of government, that the reach of government to address social problems has been debunked by results in the last generation, and that the resources of business can be applied in a more efficient and in a way of greater magnitude, and therefore it's right to harness those resources.
Well, that happens automatically. It's called the market. It's called competition. It's called choice. That's what capitalism is. And it's the most magnificent self-adjusting mechanism ever invented. Take, for example, fuel efficiency. Anyone who hasn't bought a car for 10 years, boy, you will be impressed at the mileage you get from the car you buy now. It's extraordinary. And that's not happened because, personally, I don't think that's happened because of CSR. I think it's happened because of fuel prices.
In this country, it's happened because of government regulation. Fuel prices are actually at a historic low, adjusted for inflation.
I'm not sure that's right, but anyhow.
Well, you know.
Depends where you measure.
Well, all I can tell you is that the government keeps raising the CAFE standards here, and industry goes crazy every time it does.
Well, I guess Luke's point is that the price mechanism will signal to people hamburger will get so expensive in China they'll stop eating it, maybe.
And also, I am a great believer in humanity's ingenuity. I think that throughout the ages there have been panics and scares. If you look back in history, there have always been a bunch of intellectuals who believe the world's coming to an end and that we are facing catastrophe of one sort or another. And each generation has a new one to fear. You know, it might have been the Cold War, or previous eras and generations it was different threats. Black Death, who knows? But the fact is that I believe in mankind's ability to innovate the power of technology to address and solve problems. And rising standards of living, and essentially throughout history, standards of living have risen, suggests to me that, you know, solutions will be found. Moreover, we obsess relentlessly about the rise of populations in China and so forth. Recent projections suggest that actually China's population is peaking much earlier and much lower than we thought. And that's going to have a global impact in terms of total population. India's a slightly different kettle of fish. But
they don't eat hamburgers.
Overall, it may well be that many of the, so to speak, worst fears about population peak are going to be wrong. And funnily enough, demographics is one of those things that you can predict a bit into the future. I don't mean 50 years, but certainly 10 to 20. So that's an example of how, you know, the Cassandras are likely to be proven wrong.
All right, first question for each of you. Let's talk about business school education and how it should be handled. Should this be half of business school education? Should it be a boutique course, Andy? And should it be included at all? Luke, I'll start with you, Andy.
Well, here I side with Luke. I think business schools are economic animals. They have their own business models, and this is sort of growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, you know, if you look at Beyond Gray Pinstripes and all these other places, I mean, there are hundreds of degree-granting institutions now in sustainability. And I didn't put them there, and I don't think the Cassandras put them there. The business schools have put them there. You know, every week I read about a new center at a Harvard or a Sorbonne, or, you know, I'm going to speak at Polytechnic University in Hong Kong, you know, that they're all focusing in on this. You know, whether it should be 5%, 10%, or 20%, I think you know, if you want to talk about a free market signal, you look at the way that the business school curricula has changed in the last 15 years. You know, everybody's offering courses, requirements. I mean, you know, and this is not just in CSR, but it's also in business ethics too. You know, the free market doesn't, you know, the free market's based on information, and there isn't perfect information out there. In the free market, you know, in the free market, Nike hires 10-year-old boys to stitch soccer balls and pays them 60 cents a day. Or Walmart uses suppliers that don't have fire escapes, and people die. Now, you can just chalk that up to the free market, but it's not a self-correcting problem in many cases. And again, I'm not somebody who thinks corporations are bad. I think they create certain kinds of great things, and they create certain kinds of unintended consequences. But I think, you know, we can no longer just say, well, things are great today, we're going to survive, let's be optimistic, and ignore the side effects of wealth creation.
So there's 2 points that Andy's made, I think, Luke. One is business schools are validating the idea that there's a need to staff businesses in a new way with a new kind of mindset. But he's also, for the first time, brought up corporate social irresponsibility. as proof that there has to be a corrective. Otherwise, the kind of horrors that he detailed about child labor and whatnot will be visited upon us.
Well, the free market allows for this.
I understand, but I'm going to get Luke in on this now.
Well, clearly there are courses in CSR and renewed emphasis on business ethics in business schools. You know, I think those of you who are studying an MBA or considering entering one should, you know, that's an option to you. I wouldn't advise it personally, because not that you don't need to have a grounding in ethics, but somehow I don't believe it's the sort of thing that could be, you know, taught in a classroom with a qualification at the end of it. I would have thought there are other rather more sophisticated ways of acquiring a sense of ethics in business than that. The truth is, it depends what you want to do with your life, doesn't it? Because I think there is, if you want freedom, and if you want independence, and if you want to control your own destiny, then I would recommend to you that you start and grow a business. If you want to be a cog in a giant machine and go and work in the CSR department of PepsiCo or BP or whoever it might be, then fine. But to me, I think I know which would be a hell of a lot more fun and potentially be a lot more productive for society as a whole. And yes, it's about risk-taking, and I am, by my very nature, a risk-taker. And I guess society is divided into two sorts of people. There's a minority who desire gain more than they fear loss. And those people are called entrepreneurs. And then there's the rest who are the opposite. And I guess you've got to decide which are you.
But what about Andy's quite powerful point about Nike and child labor and all of that? Is entrepreneurialism going to come to this irresponsible end, and does that give you pause?
Ever thus in existence is the criminality and misbehavior, and that applies to businesses too. And you know, there's always a very defining moment if you've had a nice middle-class upbringing and you go into business on your own, when someone rips you off in a big way. And for the first time, you realize that when it comes to large sums of money, people lie sometimes. And that's when it happens to you. And in the same way, yes, big corporations can behave badly through, you know, negligence or deliberately. And as we were saying earlier, there are such things as laws and regulation. And one of the tenets, I believe, of capitalism is rule of law. You know, you've got to play, as Milton Friedman said, within the rules. And, you know, there are different ways of applying those. One could be social pressure. The other could be prosecution. Possibly a combination of the two is appropriate, and that's what happens in society generally. But whether there are appropriate remedies in each case, I mean, in my country, for example, I'll give you a small case study. I don't know if this is CSR, but I think it shows how, you know, organizations these days can be demonized. We have a chain of stores that sell floor and wall tiles, and in one of our warehouses, a couple of the warehouse men were mucking around with a forklift truck, and they weren't meant to. It was against the rules. They had stolen the keys from the office. There was an accident. One of them lost his leg. The local authority pursued one of my partners, who was a non-executive director, because we were the controlling shareholder, with a criminal prosecution because of this. And because it was a criminal prosecution, he even had to pay his own legal fees. Now, luckily, the case was lost. The local authority was kicked out by the court. But this is the sort of thing that you know, business has to deal with these days, and I think it induces risk aversion, and I think it can lead to a safety-first mentality, which I don't think is necessarily the sign of a healthy society.
Let's open it up to you. Yes, David. Hang on, wait for the microphone. Tell us who you are and put your question in the form of a question.
Philip Capone, no affiliation. I'm curious, listening to the two of you guys, trying to reconcile my thoughts. I've lost money personally and professionally because of regulation and investments, but then I traveled to Borneo and I've seen the palm oil manufacturing facilities. We've outsourced the dirty parts of our economy largely. Where's the balance? I mean, the value of jobs is important, but then when you obviously see something from a first-person perspective, you realize it's wrong. So, what's the balance there? How do we come to some type of middle ground?
I think that's to you, Luke.
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, I can't give you a precise number as to say that's the balance. As individuals, your own moral compass and organizations that have boards and they have committees and they have auditors and they have all sorts of other checks and balances. Believe me, I sat on the board of a publicly traded American corporation, and it was a financial services business. We would spend all day in audit and other meetings. The stewardship and custodianship that, as a director of a public company, you are now under is pretty onerous. Whether any of that can stop business as a whole outsourcing its dirty activities, as you call it, I don't know. I mean, I'm not necessarily in favor of offshoring wholesale as a philosophy, because I think it does destroy domestic jobs. It depletes the supply base of an economy, and long term it can damage the competitiveness and innovation. So it's all about the particular attitudes of those who are in business. And I spend all my time, most of my working life, with entrepreneurs, and those whom I enjoy working with most, who I tend to partner with, are not those who are exclusively interested in making a fast buck. And that's not just because I don't think they create sustainable businesses, but because I don't think they see the bigger picture. And I think it's a shame, actually, that you don't see that many business people and entrepreneurs and company owners and executives writing columns like I do in the FT and saying what I really think every week. The trouble is they are too manhandled by PR people and afraid to stick their head above the parapet. Because I think if they did more of that, to, for example, defend capitalism, but also to justify their actions, then, and occasionally in public face the consequences of bad behavior, there would be better communication and more understanding on both sides of the tough choices businesses have to make. They have demanding shareholders. If they don't deliver, they might get corporate raiders who say, activist shareholders, that's the respectable phrase from these days, and the company gets sold. So in a free market, it's not easy. They have to do their best, particularly for big corporations where they're publicly traded. There are no easy solutions to this. I would point to the big picture, however, and say, as I had argued before, that overall, across the world in the last few decades, living standards have risen faster than ever before in history, and that's almost entirely due to free markets.
Andy, why don't you turn around to you, and would you make the case, and I'm guessing that you would, that a more ethical or a socially responsible attitude has minimized the kinds of abuses, if you will, that the questioner was concerned about?
Well, yes, I do think they will. And the reason I think they will is because it minimizes risk. I mean, just to be clear, I think that we are living in an age of deep uncertainty. Now, businesses have always faced uncertainty, and successful businesses, although they can't predict the future, they often do have vision, and they try to see and deal with complexity and uncertainty. All I'm saying is that a lot of the uncertainty in today's world revolves around social and environmental, we'll call them opportunities. And it makes sense for business and business students and entrepreneurs in many cases to be aware of those risks and those opportunities and to plan for them and to deal with them. So when companies...
If I might, I thought you were going to say that Nike can't do the kind of things you said before, or what the gentleman said was happening in, where was it, Borneo?
Borneo.
Right? Because they'd be embarrassed by activists who call them to account for being corporately irresponsible. Isn't that what you would argue?
Yes. I mean, one thing we haven't really talked about is what we're in a world of radical transparency. Mm-hmm. You can't pollute a well in Borneo without at least the risk of reading about it the next day in the Wall Street Journal. So yes, it's harder for companies to export these problems and get away with it. And companies don't like to be embarrassed. I mean, this is not, in addition to the moral issues involved in what's happened to General Motors, this is not a good thing for the company. This is a distraction from the art of making wealth. You can imagine how many hundreds and hundreds of people within the company, from the board down, are trying to deal with, well, Jesus, how did we do this? Or what happened at BP when the Deepwater Horizon exploded? This was a giant distraction. Now, entrepreneurs may not face those same kind of risks. They're operating, in some sense, below the radar screen, but as business people, but they do have risks. Small companies will have risks and opportunities around this, and I'm just suggesting that it behooves them to incorporate that kind of thinking in their business model.
If only for self-protection.
Only to make only to increase their chances of success.
We have a couple of gentlemen in that row.
Hi, my name is Titus Saitovsky. I'll be the devil's advocate here. Just wanted to ask you about, it seems that only large corporations have a monopoly for social responsibilities, and they can only afford it. What do you think are social responsibilities for small and medium-sized businesses, and how can we afford what you're proposing if our social responsibility is to create jobs and those employ people, which you're not going to do?
Well, I'm not against, I think creating jobs is a great thing. As someone who has been unemployed from time to time, I think job creation is very important. Let me give a short story about a company in England. There was a company called the Country Lanes. They did bike tours in Northumbria and the Lakes District, and they are a very small company, 10 or 12 employees. And the way they worked was they'd do these tours, and they'd start the tours, people would take their bikes, put them on the roofs of their cars, drive to the start of the tour, and off they'd go, and then they'd come back and they'd unload the bikes, put them on the cars and go. So somebody had the idea of, well, let's start the tours at rail stations so that people don't have to drive their cars. And they did it because they did a calculation. They figured out they'd save 8 pounds of carbon. I mean, it was actually an environmental thing to do. Well, their business went up 40% because more people had access to the tours. They didn't have to have a car. And people who ride bikes don't necessarily want to get in their cars to go ride their bikes. And then they got publicity about it, and their business went up another 40% because of it. So, they got to hire twice as many people.
And so their expenses didn't go up, is what you're saying, to the gentleman's question.
Yeah, not only did their expenses not go up, but their business increased because they did something. I mean, obviously this was very consistent with their whole, the whole reason they were in business. Get people out of their cars, onto public transportation, onto bikes, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm suggesting is that everybody, including startup entrepreneurs, can afford to look at what they're doing through what I call the lens of sustainability and make their own decisions. But it is foolhardy to simply pretend that these opportunities, or challenges and opportunities, don't exist. This is, trying to do business as usual in today's world is trying to do physics as usual after Einstein. I mean, today's world is full of these issues. And to try and just, say, well, this is how we've done it, and business, people are good, and business is smart, and we'll work our way out of this, it's too short-sighted.
But this myth that, now you can't do business as usual, in the past you could. What, during wartime you could do business as usual? The idea that this is the worst time, we face more threats than wartime, I mean, that simply cannot be right or true. And the idea that business and society in general, in 2014 faces more risks than it has in many other
No,
periods.
I didn't say more, I just said different. And climate change, whether you believe it or
I
not,
think
was not a risk 20 years ago. It was
it
just
might not be
on
a
the
risk now.
It may not be, but it's certainly on a lot of risk radars.
Yes, but maybe that's because, as humans, we need to worry about something. Maybe we need to demonize certain parts. So in the past, it was Soviet Russia. Before that, it was, who knows? If you were British, it was the French, probably. But, there was always someone to hate and someone to get angry with. And,
Well, we can agree about the French, right here and right now.
But the fact is, there aren't many baddies left. So maybe big business is as good as we can find. And they're easy to hate, and they've got deep pockets. They have their soft underbellies. And, they can pay the bill from time to time, and poor old mug GM is no doubt going to have to shell out vast sums to lawyers because that's the system. But I find it incredibly depressing, and I'm someone who in everyday life, has to deal with legal claims. I have slips and falls and in many restaurants and shops that I own and run. And, I was dealing with one 2 days ago where a woman broke her tooth. So we shelled out £10,000, of which 8 went towards lawyers. Now that, I don't think...
Nothing left for the dentist.
I don't think that's so good for society, personally, and I think that is one of the general consequences of all this demonizing of business.
Can't lawyers be entrepreneurs?
I think lawyers lower GDP rather than increase it.
Okay. Well,
we're not going to have a debate about that. That's a good debate, but it's another debate. A couple more questions. Yeah, in the front.
Hi, Scott Jeffrey. Andrew, I think what I picked up from you is that you feel, in a way, you're not being coercive in your approach, and that's an advantage. But I would see 2 areas where there may be coercion, which would be in a workplace environment. It's a hierarchical environment, so it's inherently coercive. So if I debate you on climate change, if you're my boss, I'll have to be quiet about it. So I think there's a political element to this. But then also because you're getting subsidies from many of these projects from the government. So I think there's some rent seeking as part of what you're doing. So if you could address those 2.
Yeah, Luke kept harping on subsidies too. Does that give you pause?
Well, let me address the coercion first. I mean, companies coerce workers on everything. I mean, what time to come to work, what time to leave, whether you can work at home, whether you can't work at home. Companies give philanthropy, and they don't consult the workers about it.
But not political
Of course, well, they take money from shareholders and give it away. And so I'm not sure that this is any different than that. You can say it's political. Most corporate executives who are working on these issues are doing so, I think, because they see a business case. You can agree or disagree with that case, but they're not simply imposing their own political values. They couldn't really get away with that, I don't think, for very long with boards of directors. They have to have at least the veneer of a business case. Although I'm often surprised that, companies can give hundreds of millions of dollars to the ballet and nobody says boo about it. I mean, there's no business case for it at all. In the issue of subsidies, again, now that is a place where people do get a chance to vote. I mean, government needs to be responsible. I wouldn't call it coercion. if the government is giving benefits for wind farms, there should be some accountability there. You know, whether they give benefits to the oil companies or benefits to the wind farms, wouldn't call that coercive. I would call that a decision in democracies of democratically elected governments. And if people don't like subsidies for wind, they have remedies, which is to vote out the people who are giving those subsidies.
Indeed.
I happen to believe that a lot of big corporations, I mean, the oil companies get subsidies too. They get tax breaks. So people can say, well, wind wouldn't exist without subsidies. Well, neither would a lot of what's going on in big business too. A lot of entrepreneurs get subsidies. I think it's a good idea. A lot of small businesses are brought into existence because of tax credits or, some sort of enterprise zones. People want to create jobs, so government gives breaks when you create jobs in certain places. So, that's government.
Another good but different debate. Okay, I'm going to give the last question over here.
Getting to that last point on subsidies, when you say entrepreneurs getting subsidies, it seems somewhat anti-competitive. I know the idea behind SBA loans is that they go to small business and entrepreneurs in the community, but the reality is that most SBA loans by volume and aggregate are taken by Walmart and integrated oil companies who are subdividing their business units to the franchisee level.
SBA, Luke, is the Small Business Administration. Yeah.
And that dovetails with kind of something I was thinking about, which you guys were talking about, which is cronyism. You didn't really address it too deeply. You suggested with Tesla and the subsidies that cronyism does exist. It seems that that is the real incentive to CSR. It's those who are the biggest players that can actually interact with the government to incentivize them to CSR gear their businesses. I mean, Andy Fastow was head of his business ethics TA group. I mean, where is the real competition?
Andy Fastow did an MBA.
Yes, he did.
But did he take a course in CSR?
I'm sorry, I lost the question.
I mean, with CSR, it seems somewhat anti-competitive when the biggest entities are the ones who can afford to do it, which is something you talked about. But the entrepreneurs, and we've discussed this in length, cannot afford to engage these initiatives to the same degree that PepsiCo and ExxonMobil and the large Wall Street companies can.
Well, big businesses, I mean, that's not just the point about CSR. I mean, big businesses can lobby. I mean, big businesses can do things that entrepreneurs can't do, in thousands of ways, including perhaps CSR. I don't happen to believe that this needs to be the exclusive domain of big business. It happens to be where a lot of the focus is. And frankly, it's because these are companies that have throw weight. So if you can change Walmart's behavior, you can change the world's behavior. And so, a lot of the advocates go after the bigger corporations because they see that as the most cost-effective way of driving change. I was surprised that Luke brought up Tesla as a negative example because I'm not a businessman the way he is, but I would have thought this was a great example of entrepreneurism. I mean, it may be entrepreneurism in the, wrong-headed, but isn't this guy an entrepreneur?
I'm not defending all entrepreneurs. You brought up Tesla first.
I never I said electric cars, but
I think you did mention Tesla, actually.
we have a tape. We can check this out. I'm willing to bet you 1,000 pounds I didn't.
Okay.
Well, okay, let's hear about Tesla.
And we can prove it.
The same applies with all electric cars, frankly, that they generate more carbon than the equivalent gasoline vehicle because of the costs of the batteries and so forth and so on. And the fact is that they also depend heavily on subsidy, and particularly in the case of Tesla, obviously it's a transfer from the poor to the rich, which, for those who are interested in greater equality and things, is surely not a good thing. I can't remember what was the point apart from that.
Whether I mentioned Tesla or not, I guess. Well, all automobiles benefit from subsidies. In this country, it's called the National Highway System.
No, I think it's great. Your question was, isn't Tesla entrepreneurialism? Aren't you in
yes,
favor
yes,
of
yes,
entrepreneurialism?
Yes, I
Well,
just thought you were going to
it
bring it up
is
as a positive
of-
example.
You know, I'm not against Tesla. I am not, however, so convinced of their CSR credentials.
Well,
Well, okay, I think Andy can verify those because he's in that business.
Well, I think that the idea, I think you're right about the energy. I think that these hybrid cars, do create more energy in the making. The idea would be that in the operation, there's a benefit that outweighs that. And in general, I think companies like Toyota that invented hybrid automobiles are sort of leading the direction into a new, more energy efficient way of personal transportation. Yes, fuel efficiency has improved for whatever reason, but probably not fast enough to deal with dwindling oil supplies and, if you believe the science, climate change. We must find renewable ways of powering our world. Eventually, these are not infinite resources. And I think we can agree that at some point in the future, and we can argue about when, they will run out. And hopefully by then, what you say is true, Luke, that people will have invented themselves, we will have invented our way beyond those issues. And I fervently hope there are entrepreneurs working on that right now. I'm just saying that these are problems that need to be addressed by the private sector, with or without subsidies.
But I think in two ways, for example, they are being addressed by the private sector. Firstly, for the first time in history, more or less, I think miles driven in the US fell in recent years. Certainly, I've seen some fascinating statistics suggesting young people aren't buying cars. And actually, this is the long-term real problem for GM. Young people are not buying cars. They're not even learning to drive. Numbers are falling quite sharply. Very interesting. That's the market. Secondly, what about fracking? That's just this generation's new way of making fossil fuels go further. And I believe that in generations to come, there will be other new ways of discovering sources of energy that will replace the current ones.
Well,
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Luke Johnson, Andy Savitz, and thank you.